Digital 410 Media proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt Podcast with your hosts, Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Dennis Blocker.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt Podcast, your favorite World War II-based podcast, and we are here live for another long-format episode after last week's just a catch-up episode. Sadly, but not too sadly, we're proud of him. Jeff is not going to be here today because he is heading out to welcome his son at post-cavalry training and before he heads off on his assignment. So Jeff is out doing the family thing. He will catch us up next week. Dennis is here despite the fact that Texas didn't want him to be any part of this episode. They said, hey, we're not going to just shut down your internet. We're going to kill the power at your house. He said, nay, I got a truck, I got a wheel, and I got somebody with power and internet. So he packed up his equipment and head on out.
Yes.
Importantly, our guest of the night, Robert, I got to say, first and foremost, you're breaking some boundaries here. I think you're the first fiction writer in this genre on the show. But I got to tell you, Dennis and I, I'm going to get a little hillbilly adult vernacular here. We're happy in the puppy of two Peters to read this book. It is fantastic. Sir, your book, Jeep Show, The Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge, a novel by Mr. Robert B. O'Connor. This is a masterclass on how to take historical content, add some fictional characters, and make it such a good read. We'll get into that a little bit more here in a bit because I want to get your background. But just this is a fantastic book, and I know I'm shining here, but we'll get into it here a little bit why. But first and foremost, let's get the background on you.
Sure.
How did you get into? I guess first and foremost, how did the World War II bug bite you?
Well, my father, like most men my age, my father was in World War II. He was overseas, and his younger brother, my uncle, was in the Navy in the Pacific, combat veteran. So naturally, they never said a word about it. But nonetheless, I had that interest. I've always been a history buff, and I stumbled onto the existence of this thing called a Jeep Show. I was going to write about a gentleman who was a circus promoter. And I was actually going to write a nonfiction about a certain circus he did. In my research, I talked to his daughter, and she told me about his service in World War II. The gentleman's name was Jim Hetzer, and he had tried to make it in show business in New York in the 38 and 39. He had not made it. He became a dance instructor, and then he joined the Army in 1944 at the age of 29, despite having a deferment as the parent of a child. As you well know, local draft boards were very reluctant to draft fathers. He wanted to be paratrooper, but because of his entertainment background, they put him in what is actually called special services, what I call in the book Morale Corps, which was actually the name of it up until 1942.
Do you know was there a defined line of demarcation between special services, entertainment, and then those that we know as the news reporters and the people actually filmed combat in some of the training videos? Was that a completely different department, or were they kind of
completely different department? The film, the cameramen who were shooting or filming battles would be Signal Corps, as I recall. And special services was part of Army Corps, and its own thing. And they did, as you well know, the book is about one aspect of what they did, which is small variety shows for combat infantrymen who would be pulled back from the line for a day for shower, hot meal, possibly even a uniform, exchange. And these shows were in places, they were within artillery range of the German artillery often, and the USO could not go there. Too dangerous, too difficult to get there. So this actual person was assigned MOS 442, that is entertainment soldier, and was put in the what I call the morale corps. Uh, he wrote, as most soldiers did, he wrote home from the European theater of operations, and his older sister saved every letter
Oh,
that he
God bless
wrote.
her.
I know, primary sources, primary sources.
Yeah,
Not,
we were discussing this on a
God bless
previous
her.
episode because
yeah,
Dennis is an author as well, and before he became an author as a younger man, he had the foresight to record interviews he did with a group of men who were members of an LST group that did reunions, and he still has all this footage. But we were discussing, on a previous episode, as living historians, I'm already seeing kids doing Vietnam and Gulf War impressions. And we're thinking 20, 30 years down the road, when these up and coming authors are wanting to write about their fathers or their grandfathers, or it's with the Gulf War in the early years, yes, there's going to be some handwritten letters, but in the later years, it's going to be more, oh, no, that was sent through MySpace messages or
right.
AOL Instant Messenger or Yahoo Instant Messenger and MSN communities. And
Good point. Good point.
All that stuff's going to be gone. There's going to be very little content.
Mr. O'Connor, just like imagine the historians of the future deciphering LOL, OMG. It's just not, it's not compelling writing.
Yeah.
Here's a conversation.
Even though the World War II soldiers and sailors from World War II, even if their spelling was atrocious, the way that they formed and constructed their sentences was just gorgeous. It didn't matter if he was from the hills of Arkansas or some kid from the Bronx who maybe didn't go to school. They knew how to get across what they were trying to say, and they did it beautifully. And we were just so fortunate to have that.
The equivalent to you guys finding written documentation now in 30, 40 years is going to be like on a forum. Hey guys, I was doing some research. I found a 128 megabit byte card out of a Sony Cyber shot from 2005. Anybody know how to recover these photos?
That's true.
I was told it belonged to a Gulf War vet, or
absolutely
fighting over in Iraq.
Yeah,
granted, we're gonna have 1080p, and nowadays with the Ukrainian war, 4K drone footage and everything else, we're going to see the ugly, nasty side of it, but we're going to miss out on the first-hand accounts of it.
So you are so lucky, sir. So the sister, then, she's the one who had the letters?
The older sister, his older sister, kept all the letters, and even some letters he wrote home when he was trying to make it in show business. So, and then Jim Hetzer's daughter published them in a book. So even though I went down to Dallas and interviewed them, all I had to do to read these 300 letters was order this book from Amazon.
That's amazing.
And I tell you, my copy is so dog-eared. There are sticky notes and stars and, red marks and highlights and all that. I really, it's a work of fiction, but to be able to read the day-to-day stories and complaints and positive things made it possible. I certainly wouldn't have been able to do this without that resource.
Listen, I even like your choice on the cover that you didn't put a Jeep on the cover. Like, that's a kind of smacks of show, don't tell. Like, I just kind of feel like if you had placed a Jeep on the cover, people would just assume, oh, it must be about Jeeps. And maybe it's about Jeep shows that across America where people have antique Jeeps that they're showing, and maybe it's a catalog, or maybe it's, classic Jeeps, but you didn't. So that's what intrigued me right off the bat was, well, there's just these dudes.
Right.
And man, that that emblem sure resembles the 101st patch outline.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a spotlight, but there's no G. So you know what I mean? It was
Yeah.
just like, wow, you just totally captivated me with and I got it. And I'll just tell you,
That the
I
young
can
man.
count on two hands the number of fiction books I've read in my life.
All
Just
right.
just personally, I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books.
Yeah.
But just personally, my own preference, I really feel like there's just been so many amazing things that have really happened. I don't devote hardly any time to fiction at all. And Bob, I got to tell you that I did 80 pages last night of your book, and I've been thinking about it all day. I have been looking
Cool.
so forward to getting back into it. When you write a book that you think about it during the day and you can't wait to get home so that you can get back into it, I mean, there's no better compliment than
Yeah, no, that's really, really gracious of you. Going back to one thing Don said also, when, I'm also a nonfiction reader, obviously. I do read some fiction. But there are people that you have to tell a story. If you want them to learn about what it was like in the Army in World War II, what it was like in the ETO, what it was like in the barracks, you have to tell it in a story form. And that's what I set out to do, was tell a story that people would find interesting, even people that are not like us, in what we're interested in. And along the way of telling the story, get across some fundamental points. One of the most important points I wanted to get across that I learned along the way was the difference between the Army and the rest of the services. And in fact, I wrote there's a character in the book called the reporter, and he's a war correspondent. And he explains a lot of things to Jim Tanzer, the protagonist. He's a fictional character, but I had him write a kind of summary looking back in 1946 about the war. And I had him write 4 paragraphs about the United States Army. If you'll give me permission, I'll read them to you now.
Please.
This is in the middle of a column that he wrote that, by the way, never got run. My last words have to be about our boys who went to war on the ground. They were in a completely different army than the armies of the other belligerents. Germany's was an army of professionals up until late in the war. The Red Army was filled out by peasants and factory workers with guns at their backs. The British Army reflected that nation's traditional class distinctions. The Japanese Army was its own feudal society, emphasizing loyalty to superiors and a strong sense of honor and self-sacrifice. By 1944, all 4 of these armies were wasting assets. Only America's army was increasing in size and power as the war neared its end. The American Army was larger than the nation's other military services combined. Unlike the Navy and its Marine Corps and the Army Air Corps, the Army had to rely on the draft to fill its ranks. If the other services were to some extent cherry-picked from American society, the Army was America itself, a cross-section of all of the nation's geographic, religious, economic, and ethnic groups, including Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, also known as the 3 fighting faiths. In the service of victory, we invented both the atom bomb and the idea of a Judeo-Christian nation. The Army drafted Americans from the economically backward South to the bustling industrial cities of the Midwest, from the fisheries of Maine to the timber country of the Pacific Northwest, from the Wyoming ranches to the garment factories of New York, from the North Dakota wheat fields to the Mississippi cotton fields. The Army drafted PhDs. The Army drafted immigrants who the Army taught to read and write the language of the country they served. It had to be this way given the manpower needed to fight a world war on two fronts. It was also fitting given the ideals America said it was fighting for. America fielded millions of citizen soldiers who disliked the goddamn army, were ambivalent about their officers, and resisted the trappings of military hierarchy, also known as chicken shit. Yet many of them will remember their service as the ennobling experience of their lives. If you ask them, they will tell you they fought not for their country or for lofty ideals, but for each other, for their buddies, to get the job done and get home.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I really wanted to tell that story. My editor made me cut it from the book, so I put it on the website. But the army was America itself, in all its different facets, all in the army. And the protagonist was in the army, and I try to show some of the different ethnic groups and characters that he is with.
The outline of this book, because of the theme, Jeep show, USO shows, stripped down version, as you say,
Yeah.
the A-ration version of USO.
Yeah.
show.
Yes.
You got Mickey Rooney, you got reference to vaudeville, you have fictional characters. Two questions. Obviously, one of them is more of a statement and an assumption on my part, but
Sure.
I would assume having fictional characters, even if they are loosely based off real people, it allows you the freedom to tell a more wide swath story. Because once again, if you write a true story about a true individual who may have seen one or two campaigns,
Right,
you're stuck in that realm. Whereas when you have a Jim Tanzier, and take this for the spirit in which I intended,
yes,
the way you write this, he's almost like a Forrest Gump-esque character, as in that he is the conduit that allows you, the author, to tell multiple historical series in a way that you couldn't otherwise tie them together using true characters.
that's very insightful. And in fact, one of my favorite reviews on Amazon is the title is Forrest Gump meets Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
Oh, first off, Mickey Rooney. I mean,
Yeah.
I grew up watching Mickey Rooney. My grandmother and my mom, like, I just watched. I recorded all the time AMC, that channel, American
Yeah.
Classics.
Yeah.
And you nailed Mickey Rooney.
Yeah.
Did you watch a lot of film on him? And
I watch some film. I'm mostly a reader. So I read his autobiography, and then I read his second autobiography. The thing that struck me about Mickey Rooney, I've always been interested in the concept of genius. And there's a great saying, talent does what it can, but genius does what it must. You know, Mickey Rooney was an absolute genius. Marlon Brando, his director, said he was, other than Charlie Chaplin, he was the best actor they ever worked with.
My goodness.
Now, where there are great strengths, this is the problem with being a genius and why we're glad we're not, or at least I'll speak for myself. Where there are great strengths, there are great weaknesses. Mickey Rooney's was off the rails his whole life. He was an absolute wild man. He had bees in his bonnet. He was probably a gambling addict. He was probably an alcoholic. He was very active socially in Hollywood with all sorts of women.
I mean, Ava Gardner, for God's
Yeah, he was married to the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, and he cheated on her. Yeah, Mickey Rooney was an absolutely magnetic character, and he also, his career faltered badly after the war, and to some extent it was already faltering. You know, at 5'1",
Yeah.
he was getting too old to play Andy Hardy, but he was way too short to be a leading man, and so and he had some terrible business ideas as well. But one of the things if I write a sequel, I want to explore Mickey Rooney in the bad times, you know, because he ended up having to make a living, but he would go to cocktail parties and do a routine at somebody's house for a cocktail party, and
Oh, man.
they gave him $20 or $50.
Heartbreaking.
But he stuck with it.
Mm.
He never gave up. He never gave it up. So fascinating character, absolutely fascinating.
Just so lovable.
That's the old time equivalent to when you see actors doing cameos now, where you
right.
I'll send you $50, say happy birthday to my friend Steve.
Right.
Huge fan of you and Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. So,
I hadn't thought about that, but that's exactly right. I think it has more dignity than those cameos, but
yeah, because that's a smaller sample size, get the same dignity.
Yeah.
It's kind of like back in the day, struggling actors, they would go over to China or Japan and do commercials that would never be seen there. Because back in the 80s and 90s, if you were an actor, you didn't cross over to TV.
Right.
You'd always go to TV and movies and never look back. So the movie stars would go do commercials in China and Japan, knowing that they won't get played here. But once it became cool to do both TV and then obviously with the internet, everything open and good.
Yeah.
I loved your the book is full of Easter eggs for everyone listening.
Thank you.
For everyone listening, this book is full of Easter eggs. It's got something for everybody. I mean, that'll probably be a project I do one day, to see how many Easter eggs I can find and compare it with other guys doing the same thing and see how many numbers we come up with. Yeah. The reference to the road movies, I mean, I freaking loved that.
Yeah.
And because growing up as a kid, once again, Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, the road movies, and Dorothy Lamour, and it was just, that was so great. Referencing the CCC, not everybody's going to catch it, but
the civilian. One of the things my editor did was make me get rid of a giant chapter I wrote about the Civilian Conservation Corps, and I had to shrink it down to that page and a half. But such an incredible American adaptation to the Depression.
Yep.
Young men from struggling families could go and they would get 3 solid meals a day. They'd be given a uniform. They'd be out in the woods. They'd be actually, making things at, campgrounds and, trails and other parks, and fighting forest fires. And I think they got paid, $50 a month, and 35 of it got sent home automatically. They weren't even, because the people back home needed that. So, and
it was
just
it was loosely Army themed as far as
absolutely.
We had Wild Bill Garnier's son and granddaughter on here.
Really?
Yeah, and they were talking about how he was in the civilian conservation course before he even signed up. For the Army and Airborne, and because so many high school, pre-college age men did that, and because of the loose Army logistical organization, because anytime you have that many people in an area, you got to have organization,
right?
And so the people who really stride in that environment, it was an easy transition to go from the CCC into Army boot camp. And as we were talking earlier off video, kind of having a foot ahead of everybody else.
They wore in many of the camps. They wore World War I uniforms. They were issued.
Wow.
They were issued World War. So yes, it was Army before we had a big Army.
And those structures they built are still standing today,
absolutely.
Still being used.
Absolutely.
I visited my grandmother up in Baraboo, Wisconsin. There was a CCC camp nearby, and the guys that worked there, they were refurbishing and building up what became Devil's Lake State Park there in southern Wisconsin. And the buildings are still there. They're made of stone. And my grandmother met Delbert Brond there, and they started dating and fell in love. And he was in the CCC, and when then the war started, he became a top turret gunner on a B-25, and he was killed in August of 43 in the Pacific. So he never got to marry my grandmother. But I did track down his family. I talked to his brother, and they still have his CCC footlocker. And when you open it, my grandmother's pictures are still taped inside. Isn't that something?
That is amazing. You know, Don, one thing that I haven't told many people is, and it's one of the springboards for this book, is I have had an abiding interest in morale and how people do the hard things
Mm-hmm.
that have to be done, whether you like it or not. I went through it like we all do. I went through a very tough patch in my life, probably full of first world problems, but seemed tough to me. And I really got into this idea of morale and how we do those hard things. And that's also, this is the morale corps in World War II. And doing the hard thing, being a frontline combat infantryman out in the weather, under threat of artillery or mortars, dealing with chicken shit from military police.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that will shine through, but we talk about as writers our fondest wish. My fondest wish probably is that people will take away a good story and learn something, if they don't, about World War II in the ETO and the Battle of the Bulge. But my fondest wish is that people will see how these frontline soldiers maintain their morale.
This has been a Digital 410 production.